This second unit focuses on the League of Nations, and it asks the question, to what extent was the League of Nations a success? So the idea is that at the end of the unit, you should be able to evaluate if the League of Nations was successful in its mission or if it failed in its mission, and for what reasons. This unit is divided into 5 focus points. The first one looks at the weaknesses of the League of Nations and asks the question if these weaknesses made then the League of Nations failure inevitable. The second one looks into different case studies in the 1920s and assesses if they were successes or failures. Then the third one looks at the impact of the Depression on the League of Nations. The fourth one looks at different case studies in the 1930s, again, to try to understand if they were successes or failures. And finally, the fifth focus point is the one we're going to try to understand why did the League of Nations then not reach its goal to preserve world peace. Now, this first focus point that we start today, we're going to try to understand what were the aims of the League of Nations, who were the members, so the League's membership, and finally how the League was organized. Remember, as you watch the video, make sure you're taking notes using the worksheet and pause the video as needed to complete your notes. Let's start the first focus point. We're going to first try to understand a little bit what was the League of Nations and how it was born. And then afterwards, we will look at different aspects of the League of Nations, try to understand if in fact it was doomed to fail from the beginning. So, first of all, the League of Nations, of course, was an international peacekeeping organization that was born after the First World War. The League of Nations was born at the end of the First World War because at that time world leaders agreed that an international organization to solve international problems was needed in order to avoid future wars. Now, there were 3 different views. Of course, we know that Woodrow Wilson, the American president, was the one that initially proposed this idea of the League of Nations in his 14 points. Wilson's view was that the League of Nations would be a world parliament where world leaders would meet regularly. Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, on the other hand, wanted a more simple organization that would meet only in times of emergency. And Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, wanted the League of Nations to be a strong assembly that had its own army. In the end, the winning view was that of Wilson. So the League of Nations was born as this world parliament where nations could meet regularly to try to find solution to problems. Then on April 29, 1919, the Covenant of the League of Nations was adopted, and this was to become the initial part of all of the First World War peace treaties. The League of Nations formally came into being the next year, on January 10, 1920, when finally the Covenant that had been ratified by those 42 nations the year before took effect. And just for those of you who don't know this word, this is a new term, make sure you learn it. Covenant is just another word for agreement. Okay? So it's an agreement that was signed by 42 nations to create this new assembly, the League of Nations. Now we look at the aims of the League of Nations, which were set out in the Covenant. It was divided in 26 articles, and the main goal was to discourage aggression from any nation, to prevent future wars. The League of Nations also wanted to encourage countries to cooperate, especially in business and trade. President Wilson had the idea that if countries were business partners, if they were engaged in trade, this would actually prevent them from going to war against each other because that would go against their commercial, their business interests. The League also wanted to encourage nations to disarm This once again related to the idea of preventing future wars. It also worked to improve living and working conditions for people around the world. And finally, the League wanted to promote collective security. Now, what is collective security? Collective security is an arrangement that establishes that an aggressor against any state is considered an aggressor against all the other states, which will then act together to repel the aggressor country. So what does this mean? Is that if a country threatens one country, another country, all the other members of the League of Nations will come together, will act together to repel the aggressor country. So to protect the country that is being threatened. Now I would like to show you a short video about the birth of the League of Nations. Please click on the image there. You will find the YouTube link. And as you watch this video on YouTube, please think of the question, how did the League of Nations change international diplomacy and cooperation? That is, how did the League of Nations represent a new chapter in international diplomacy, how countries actually cooperated with one another? Pause this presentation, watch the video on YouTube, and then come back to finish the presentation. As we saw in the video, the League of Nations represented a new era in world diplomacy and international agreements. And this new organization had some strengths, which we will look into. First of all, the League of Nations, as the video showed you, was a permanent organization which did not have any ties to any specific country. So this means that it could work in a more independent way. It also had a clear structure and set procedures for dealing with aggressive nations. It also had many members, initial membership of 42 nations. The League also provided a forum in which both large and small nations could discuss international problems. So these small nations could also have a platform to present their issues, discuss them, and try to reach agreements. And finally, the League moved away from the old system of secret treaties and alliances. So this was supposed to be diplomacy out in the open, in a way that countries would then avoid future aggressions if they used this arrangement. If they used the League of Nations as a place to discuss their problems, their conflicts, before it turned into a war, before it escalated into an armed conflict. Even though membership of the League of Nations fluctuated over the years, and we will talk a little bit more about this later on, but you can see from this map that basically every continent was represented in the League of Nations, even though there were countries that joined from the beginning, others that joined later, some that left the League of Nations before the League of Nations was ended. But you can see that then the League of Nations was truly international. And it was something new because for the first time, even smaller countries, weaker nations, let's say, also had a saying in international relations. The League of Nations also had many weaknesses, and for the IGCSE, you need to learn these different weaknesses to try to understand if the League of Nations was actually doomed from the beginning. If the weaknesses were so strong, were stronger than the strengths that made the League of Nations an organization that could not have succeeded anyways. Now we're going to look at different weaknesses. The first one is the membership. Now, as we said, initially the League of Nations had 42 members. This number will vary throughout the years. By the 1920s, we have 44 members. 32 of them are allies. So you can see how the allied side is the majority in the League of Nations. This could be seen as a problem for it, but we'll talk more about this later on. The United States was not a member. The United States never joined the League of Nations. It did not ratify the covenant of the League of Nations, and we'll talk more about this as well in a minute. Then Russia was not a member either. This was a decision that sought to isolate the communist regime. So remember that Russia had gone through a revolution during the First World War, it became a communist country, and so this was an attempt to isolate the communists. And Germany was not allowed to become a member until 1926. It might come as a surprise the fact that the United States never joined the League of Nations, given that the League was an idea of its president, Wilson. Now, for what reasons did the US then reject the League of Nations? When Wilson came back to the United States, he submitted the Treaty and the Covenant of the League of Nations to Congress for Congress to approve it and to ratify it. To ratify just means to make an agreement official. Now, why did Wilson have to do this? Because by American law, any international agreement that the United States engages in has to be approved by the US Senate. So it only becomes official after the United States Senate votes and approves it. But opposition within Congress and also the American press had already begun building against the Treaty of Versailles and against the Covenant of the League of Nations, even before Wilson had left for Paris. And this was also a problem. I mean, Wilson had to try then to convince the American people that the League of Nations was something positive for the United States. What did he do then? He went on a train journey, a 27-day train journey, to try to convince people to gain public support for the League of Nations. And he would speak to people in cities all around America. But unfortunately, Wilson then was not in very good health at that time, and he had to stop his tour, go back to Washington, and he had a stroke. So he could no longer, because of his health, continue this fight for the League of Nations. And there was a problem, a political problem as well, which was the fact that there were elections in 1918, just right before the approval of the Covenant of the League of Nations, and Republicans, they controlled both the House and the Senate, so the two bodies of Congress, and Wilson was a Democrat. Therefore, there was opposition that came from the Republican Party towards Wilson and his ideas. And there was the leader, say, of this opposition was the Senate Majority Leader, who was also the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, who was Henry Cabot Lodge. You can see his picture there. He was the main person that headed this movement against the League of Nations. And what were the reasons then that the Republicans gave for rejecting the League of Nations, for their opposition to the League of Nations? First of all, was simply the fact that many Americans did not like the Treaty of Versailles. And the League of Nations was directly linked to the treaty, since the Covenant of the League of Nations formed the first part of the treaty and all the other peace treaties. Now, of course, the Americans did not like the treaty. Many of them thought it was a very harsh treaty. And there was a very big German population in the United States, lots of German immigrants who in fact had opposed even America joining the war against Germany, and these people were against the Treaty of Versailles as well. Another reason was that many Americans thought that the League of Nations would be very costly for the United States, that they would be called to engage in any kind of world problem, and this could end up being something very expensive. And business leaders in the United States did not want then America to get involved in other international wars or affairs. So they said, we need to stay out of European affairs. We cannot, otherwise we're going to ruin our economy. That was one point of view. Another reason was isolationism. Now, isolationism, as the word suggests, is just the idea that the country should remain isolated. So some people believed that because of the League of Nations, America would have to be involved in every kind of conflict that happened. So any kind of dispute that happened around the world, America would have to fight to send troops. And many people said that the United States should not be involved in other wars, that they should be isolated from the rest of the world, just focus on trade and stay out of conflicts. And finally, another reason was simply the fact that many Americans thought that the League of Nations was going to be used by France and by Britain just to reinforce their own ambitions of expanding their empire, so their own imperialist ambitions. And the Americans, they did not believe in empire. They had fought against the British Empire to gain their independence. And so, like this, they thought that this League of Nations was just going to be an instrument of the old empires, and they opposed them. So finally, in March of 1920, the Treaty of Versailles and the Covenant of the League of Nations were defeated in the Senate vote, meaning that the senators voted against it, and the United States did not join the League of Nations. In the following year, in 21, Warren Harding was elected as a new president, and he had in fact run on a platform that opposed the League of Nations. And when he won, this meant that the United States for sure were not going to join the League of Nations. Let's say it was the nail on the coffin on the idea that the US might one day become member of the League of Nations. However, the absence of the Americans in the League of Nations was only one part of its problem when it came to membership. As you can see there, the League of Nations also lacked some other important countries. Now, when it started, you can see here that when it first met and when it started in 1920, the most important countries that were members were Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. And little by little, the number of members will be increased. In fact, later that year in December, Austria, one of the defeated countries, was allowed to join the League of Nations. Then finally, in 26, Germany was also welcomed into the League of Nations. And so, finally, we have Germany as the defeated country that is, as according to the point of view of the Allies, has proven that it's willing to embark in cooperation and peace, and so it was now allowed to join the League of Nations. And then finally, in 34, the Soviet Union also became a member. Now let's have a look at a summary of the weaknesses regarding memberships of the League of Nations and the impacts that these weaknesses had on the League. First of all, as we saw, the United States was not a member. And why did this impact the League in a negative way? First of all, without the United States, it meant that the League of Nations didn't have as much power against offending nations, because without the Americans, they lost resources. Of course, the US at that time was the wealthiest country in the world, and it also lost military power that could have pressured countries to avoid conflict, again with the idea of collective security. But it also meant that any economic sanctions would be ineffective. We will talk a little bit more about economic sanctions later on, but this was just a way that countries of the League of Nations could punish aggressor countries by imposing some trading restrictions on them. But of course, if the United States was not part of the League of Nations and the United States did not take part in these restrictions, these sanctions would then be ineffective. And finally, the League of Nations without the United States became mostly an European organization that was dominated by France and Britain. Another problem of the League of Nations is that the defeated powers were excluded. As we know, Germany was only allowed to join in 1926. And what is the problem with that? Why is this going to be then a negative impact for the League of Nations? It's because then the League of Nations is going to be regarded, it's going to be seen as a winner's club, meaning that it's an organization that only defends, supports the allies, not really a world peacekeeping organization. Another weakness was that it had fluid membership. And this we also saw before, that the number of members went up and down throughout the years. Countries joined and left. And the result of this is that the League seemed less necessary. It seemed less binding. So as if countries really didn't have an obligation towards the League, but they could leave, come and go as it pleased them. Finally, Britain and France were the only constant major powers. And why was this a problem? First of all, is that Britain and France were unwilling to intervene in conflicts when this might cost them money or also men. So after the First World War, of course, France and Britain were not really willing to take part in other conflicts. Second of all, is that they didn't want to act outside of Europe unless their interests were directly threatened. So they didn't want to get involved in conflicts that were taking place in faraway places that did not directly concern them. Then, they were unwilling to go to war, even if it was to protect long-term peace. So they thought more of the short-term consequences. And they did not, as we said, want to get involved in other conflicts, even if in the long run that would have meant preventing another war. And finally, Britain and France often disagreed because they often had different interests. So it was hard to come with a unified plan of action for the League of Nations at times. Now we look into a second weakness of the League of Nations, which is its organization. The League of Nations, as we have seen, was a permanent organization that had permanent working bodies. The first one was this was the Parliament of the League of Nations. This Parliament would meet once a year, and it would on the League's issues, such as how much it would spend each year, agree to accept new members, and decisions in the League of Nations had to be unanimous. So in the Assembly, votes had to be unanimous, meaning that every member had to agree for a decision to be approved. Now, this Assembly included all the countries that were part of the League of Nations. The League also had another working body, which was the Council. Now, the Council was a small group of countries that would meet 5 times a year, or if there was an emergency. The Council had temporary and permanent members. These temporary members were elected, usually for 3-year periods, and the permanent members were Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. When Germany joined the League in 1926, it also became a permanent member of the Council. Afterwards, it left the League, and later on, in 1934, the Soviet Union became a member, and it also became a permanent member of the Council. Each permanent member of the Council had the power of veto. And veto means that they could basically block any action. So if one of these permanent members disagreed with something, they could vote against it, and that was it. I mean, no other country could overrule this decision. And when there were crises, it was the Council then that made that took all the important decisions. So the discussions of our emergencies, any kind of crisis, they were voted by the Council. Now, the League also had a secretariat, which is just basically the offices, so the people that dealt with paperwork and making sure that the League ran smoothly. The League also had some committees. Afterwards, in your book, you will read more about. There were many different commissions that worked with international problems. For example, trying to abolish slave labor, trying to improve health, working conditions, helping resettle refugees after the First World War. So there were a number of these commissions that were also called committees, and they did various kinds of work trying to improve living and working conditions. Finally, also the judicial branch of the League, which is the Court of International Justice, that helps to settle disputes between countries. So just like any other court of law, it would listen to both sides of an argument and then would make a decision. And how did the League of Nations then exactly keep peace? So the League of Nations had a protocol that it would follow in case a country threatened another country, in case there was a threat to world peace. So the first step would be moral condemnation. This, in agreement with the principle of collective security, all the countries of the League of Nations would condemn this action and aggression by a country. And of course, they would use also public opinion against this country so that they would make sure that this country was kind of, let's say, embarrassed of its aggression and would retreat because of that. If that didn't work, the League could impose economic sanctions, making sure that no League member would trade with the offending country. They could use a trade embargo, which is a block, meaning that this country then would become isolated. None of the members would accept to trade with it. And this way, by hurting the offending country's economy, they hoped that the country would stop whatever act of aggression it had started. And if that didn't work, finally the League could resort to military force. Now, the League did not have an army of its own, and so it had to depend on troops that would be sent by its member states. Now, there were problems with each one of these things. First of all, when it came to moral condemnation, simply a nation, the aggressor, could choose to ignore the condemnation and still move on, carry on with its aggression. When it came to economic sanctions, there was the problem that this trade embargo, if there was a block, it would only be useful if all powerful trading nations were members of the League. And as we know, the United States was not a member of the League of Nations. This already created a problem regarding an embargo, so to enforce a trade embargo. And finally, countries were often hesitant to use a trade embargo because after the First World War, their economies were in ruins and they didn't want to lose money by blocking a trade partner. So they actually didn't want to use this strategy because it might end up hurting their economy as well. And with military force, the problem was that without an army of its own, the League then depended on the willingness of its members to send their own troops, to send their own men to fight in conflicts that many times did not involve them directly. And of course, after the First World War, most countries were reluctant to use force again. They didn't want to be involved in other military conflicts, especially because public opinion was very much against other conflicts. Now, having had this little introduction to the League of Nations, I want you to complete the tasks that are in the worksheet on Google Classroom, and we will discuss these points later on in class.